Thanks for providing this opportunity to discuss Bodhicitta. And for today, I thought that we could explore compassion in popular culture more broadly. And the main impetus for this topic is really in part in thinking about the popularization and even the secularization of Buddhist meditation and philosophical ideas that we see occurring throughout the West right now. Something that's quite unique about Buddhism is that it's popular to appropriate, and it's also considered appropriate to appropriate it, which is very unusual, actually, these days. Most traditions have a certain sense of distance, right? And people can be quite sensitive about those aspects being singly selected, used to other purposes, and so on. But Buddhism is quite unique in this way, in part, perhaps because we have a range of ideas about what defines it. It could be a religion, but sometimes is often described not as a religion. Some people describe it as just a philosophy, others as a way of life. And just to begin, I thought I would ask, what distinguishes these three? What is the difference between a religion, a philosophy, and a way of life?
Just off the top of my head, religion is something that we kind of relate to in relationship to like a higher power or a god or rules to live by. Philosophy is a little bit more maybe of a mental construct that has us think about life in more intellectual, philosophical kind of ways. And a way of life. Was that the third one? Way of life?
Yes.
I mean, that could incorporate both of the first two, but maybe it's more operational as far as how we're actually engaging in the world, and that incorporates our beliefs, our philosophy, and our religion, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a very clear distinguishing of all three in the way that we often understand them. And truth be told, the way that the term religion has been defined and used, even critically in the academic tradition, for a long time really looked at religion as just being Abrahamic or even just Christianity and Islam. And then there was everything else, right? Like us Buddhists on the outside of this whole thing. And so it's only more recently that religion has really taken on a mode of definition that's more inclusive, where the idea is that there's supposed to be a sense of objectivity that approaches all of these traditions equally, not privileging one or a couple over all of the others. So it's quite distinct in that way. Philosophy, of course, has a lot to do with tenets, intellectual systems, argumentation, and all of this. And sometimes, even terminologically, like philosophy is less sensitive, right? We can talk philosophy. We can be wrong about philosophy, right? We can assert that we're right about philosophy. But no one's really going to get too upset unless you propose to be a representative of a certain philosophy. And then, of course, things can get interesting, messy, provocative, and so on. And then likewise, as Tom was saying, I think a way of life, it's kind of the most open, and it really reflects a lot of the ways in which Westerners now approach religion. A lot of people aren't so comfortable being affiliated with institutions, being part of these types of hierarchies, but they still like a lot of these various spiritual aspects. And so what people are quite comfortable with today in many respects is borrowing pieces from these to construct their own individual way of life that's something of a hybrid of many different ideas and interests. And so, especially among younger populations, it's often the case that they don't have a lot of interest in being institutionally affiliated with a religion. Even the term religion is like a turnoff, right? But there's still a strong sense of spirituality, a strong sense of purpose, and a strong search for meaning, right? And so way of life provides a lot of leeway and freedom in terms of how we define our own individual paths. But there's also very specific ways to define these, and in particular, religion is one that's been debated for a long time. It's gone back and forth a lot. And more recently, there's a definition that I really like by a scholar out of the University of Chicago known as Bruce Lincoln, who presents what are known as these 4 domains of religion. So the first, he says, is a discourse whose concerns transcend the human temporal and contingent, in that claims for itself a similarly transcendent status. So a discourse, of course, is like a discussion. It's terms, it's words, it's the way we talk about a particular system. And so this discourse here, and what defines it as religious, is one that transcends the human temporal, time-based, and contingent, or the dependencies of the world. So I think we certainly have some of that in Buddhism. There's a lot of discourse in Buddhism more broadly. And likewise, this is also the place where philosophy would fall in. So all of these tenets about what defines and differentiates our relative world from its true nature and so on occurs within the forum of discourse. The second that Lincoln lays out is a set of practices whose purpose is to produce a proper world and or proper human subjects as defined by a religious discourse to which these practices are connected. And so, of course, we can see very clearly in Buddhism, we've got lots of practices, right? An incredible richness and diversity of practices that helps us hopefully become better human beings, contribute to less suffering in the world, and of course, in Buddhism, ultimately to transcend it in many respects. So Buddhism certainly has both of these. We're 2 for 4 in Bruce Lincoln's definition of religion so far. Third is a community whose members construct their identity with reference to a religious discourse and its attendant practices. I think in many respects we could look at Sangha that way, certainly. And, there's nothing, kind of aggressive about identifying this way. I don't know if it feels like that. But it's basically to say, like, all right, we take on these ideas, right? And that helps define us both as a group and also deeply influences the way in which we perceive ourselves in the world, right? Self and other, we could say. So community, we got that. We even got a special word for it. And then finally, the fourth of these 4 domains is an institution that regulates religious discourse, practices, and community, the first 3, reproducing them over time and modifying them as necessary while asserting their eternal validity and transcendent value. So there's always nuances in how this is done, of course, the functionality of an institution and so on. But I think we can see, of course, that within Buddhism we have lots of institutions as well, monasteries and so on. And even we could see Nalanda Bodhi, of course, as a kind of institution, hopefully framed within a context that's truly conducive to the benefit of others and ourselves. So those are the 4, and we can see that Buddhism, according to a contemporary definition of religion, really does fit within the definition of religion. What's missing from these 4 domains? I think Lincoln published this at least like 3 to 5 years ago. I'm sure there's lots of scholars who are jumping all over him at this point to suggest everything that he's missed and everything that's wrong about it. What do you think? What's missing from these definitions against what we ordinarily understand as definitive of religion?
Faith.
Faith, yes. That's the first one that came to mind for me too. It's not considered prerequisite within this particular presentation, which I think is very interesting, because usually we would certainly look at faith, belief, so on, whatever that is, however we define it, as definitive. And yet it's missing here. And in particular, what's missing is any sense of blind faith, which also has been a way in which we framed religion within our own tradition, not something that we hold to, but actually work directly against, right? We need to test this out for ourselves and really explore Buddhism until we understand it ourselves, truly gain conviction in it ourselves. There's a lot of rhetoric around constancy of truth, right? That's a big one. And that's what's being pointed out here with a sense of eternal validity. Like oftentimes there's the idea this is always true, never changes, and so on. And, Buddhism, of course, is very nuanced with regard to this particular point. On the one hand, if we talk about the most essential elements of reality, if we use some of those terms like ultimate bodhicitta, emptiness, dharmakaya, of course, those are said to be eternally valid, eternally true. And yet, the way in which we talk about them and the way in which we strive to realize them does change over time. So even within the Buddhist tradition, we can see the ways in which, quite skillfully, there's an evolution of the presentation, an evolution of ideas, and likewise an evolution of practices to help us realize them. And of course, this is absolutely necessary, right? Even translation from one language into another is a profound transformation of that particular tradition and its ideas, right? Absolutely necessary, and is something that occurs over time and is even in many respects welcomed in Buddhism, I would say, as a means of making these teachings continuously relevant and accessible to new audiences. So that really brings us to the discussion today, which is the ways in which compassion practices in particular are being used more broadly within popular culture, and likewise the ways in which they're being studied in neuroscience and psychology these days. So with compassion and other aspects, again, we know that religion shouldn't be appropriated, but oftentimes Buddhism gets a pass because in the West, in so many respects, it's not really considered religious. And by means of that, what we've seen is that there's many aspects of Buddhism that have indeed been appropriated and transformed by their integration into popular ideas, popular practices, often without very little reference or real understanding of the traditions from which they emerged. So among these, perhaps the most famous of all, we're in the midst of this revolution, right? The mindfulness revolution continues, which is really quite extraordinary. There's an incredible amount of interest in this still, and a lot of research going into it, these various practices. So if we look at mindfulness more broadly as the way in which Buddhist ideas and practices have been incorporated into popular culture, what do we lose when they become divorced from their traditions of origin?
I think the main point of that is my thinking about that is that the reason why you're doing these practices is individual in the mindfulness revolution, and it is not connected to goals of, say, bodhicitta or compassion for others or compassion really at all. It's about calming your mind individually.
Yeah. I mean, those individual objectives become truly individualized, and it becomes separated from the larger context that drives it, just as you're saying. Absolutely.
I would say that the mindfulness movement is often, not always, but very often attached to ideas of gaining and transaction. And that that's very different from it being a map or a tool for understanding the nature of mind.
Yes, and so there's this discussion of mindfulness too, of course, right? A wonderful term where it really points to the commodification of mindfulness. Rather than thinking about the ways in which it can truly be of any benefit for anyone else, it's really about yourself, your own cognitive skill set, perhaps, and it really becomes divorced from these larger intentions of the traditions from which they arose. Absolutely.
Oh, it's just actually to add exactly, bottom line, lineage. It's missing out on this huge, vast experience that these paths are traveling along.
Yeah, Absolutely. And I think lineage, in so many respects, condenses much of the meaning of what's lost there, right? Because, of course, when we talk about lineage in the Buddhist tradition, we're not just talking about, a bunch of mostly dudes who transmitted some ideas for 2,600 years, right? It's much more about this transmission of awakening, a transmission of richness, and a transmission of knowledge that keeps these paths and practices both accessible and attainable. So a lot's lost. And I don't want to, present the perspective that it's never done well. I think that we do see plenty of examples today of different organizations that do this type of mindfulness for a general audience really well. I think Insight Meditation Society, IMS, has always had a strong harmony between Buddhist ideas and psychology. That was really a lot of their core teachers' training from the very beginning. And I think they do an extraordinary job of both maintaining the wisdom of their lineages, which they take very seriously, and also making these practices more accessible. But we also see inevitably that, especially for people without contact with individuals and institutions who are deeply steeped and practiced in these traditions, that there's an incredible array of misinformation and misconception that really undermines the potential that these practices have always had. So if it is to be a Buddhist mindfulness or a Buddhist compassion, as we'll discuss further here, and not just something generic, then of course, just as all of you said, it must be deeply informed by the lineage, by the tradition, right? And you would think that knowing that it's been around for 2,600 years, maybe there's something to be learned there, And how do we gain greatest access to this continuity of wisdom, but by approaching those who actually continue to hold them? So it really seems to be essential there that this continues. And likewise, for people who are outside of these traditions, hopefully we'll find the opportunity to go a bit more deeply with them. But it's a range right now. So that's mindfulness. But the focus of this discussion and this retreat, of course, is Bodhicitta. A larger question here is about kindness and compassion, really as fundamental human values. Kindness and compassion as fundamental human values, right? What we find, of course, in surveying the range of the world's religious traditions is that love, or some expression of it, is really at their epicenter, certainly of their ethics in terms of their conduct, and then also often at their metaphysics, right? On so many levels, some sense of the love, the sense of the divine. Even in Buddhism, when we talk about ultimate bodhicitta, it's compassion and emptiness inseparable, right? So we find this really at the heart of it. But what is distinct about loving kindness and compassion in the Buddhist tradition? What separates Buddhist definitions of these terms from those in other traditions, and moreover, just a broader sense of human ethics, many of which have a high appreciation for them?
The lack of bias, the fact that it's to be directed to everyone without there being a distinction or differentiation between groups or other characteristics.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's like in the rhetoric, in the language of so many traditions, it's about inclusion, right? Everyone should be a part of this. But a lot of the time, if you're not already a part of this, then you don't get to be included within that, right? And so again, there's incredibly strong distinction between us and them. And we see inevitably an incredible amount of conflict arise in the history of the world as a result of those distinctions. So it truly is a problem there. And likewise in Buddhism, and not to say it's always practiced perfectly, we have conflicts in Myanmar and elsewhere right now where there's anything but a strong view of equanimity in the practice of loving and kindness and compassion being exerted. But at the epicenter of Buddhism, and of course in holding up to its ideals, the idea is that, just as Karen said, it's truly equal. It truly extends to all, which is really quite extraordinary. Somewhere there it doesn't say you have to think like we do, or believe like we do, or practice like we do, in order to be included within this heart of loving kindness and compassion. So I think that is something that distinguishes both our definition and practice of loving kindness and compassion within Buddhism. And likewise with that, in terms of that larger view, we also have these specific terms, there are definitions, and these various methods and practices that are quite unique to Buddhism. And so those two make them not generic, but specifically Buddhist. Tom, you're going to add to that or add to something?
Get there. I just wanted to include, the notion of interdependence, which kind of the idea that we're all really kind of part of the same thing. And then what Mitra Tyler was talking about yesterday, the idea that, everybody's been our mother. I mean, that just, it creates so much kind of glue for these ideas of compassion to permeate everybody, and it's we're all one being. So that's also pertinent, I think.
Yes, for sure. And I think bringing in that sense of interdependence as a fundamental principle in Buddhist view, right, of course opens up in the Mahayana to this idea, well, if it's all interdependent, then we're all necessarily interconnected in this way. And so it's true, we see this profound expansion of inclusion that occurs by means of these views, which again really does distinguish Buddhism from many of these other traditions. And, especially when we're striving for its ideals. And I think, look, I mean, a lot of traditions use this type of rhetoric. Christianity is supposed to be about love for all. And I think that probably the historical Jesus was, that'd be my guess. But we don't know too much about him anymore, unfortunately. And the institutions that remain have been oftentimes anyway, a bit less inclusive in their purview. So yes, these are very good and clear distinctions about the way in which kindness and compassion are defined within Buddhism. And breaking it down in this way, of course, we can look at it along the lines of the core topic for this retreat, which is relative bodhicitta. But of course, if we talk about relative bodhicitta, and likewise the practices associated with it, we have to talk at least a little bit about ultimate bodhicitta too. The foundational definition of bodhicitta is the desire to awaken fully for the benefit of beings, right? The desire to awaken fully for the benefit of beings. And again, it's not the benefit of one particular group, it's not the benefit of our own group exclusively, but the benefit of all. And moreover, embedded within it, which shouldn't be set aside, is this notion of awakening. Because, of course, in this view, the idea is that not only are we all capable of it, but that awakening is our fundamental true nature. So in terms of working our way towards awakening to that, on the one hand, we have relative bodhicitta, which of course is divided into aspiration, the wish itself, and then application, acting on that wish. That's the primary division of relative bodhicitta: the wish, the aspiration, and the application, the action, compassionate action. And then ultimate bodhicitta is the doctrine of emptiness writ large, but in particular, we have the doctrine not just of emptiness, right? And we emphasize this in Nalanda Bodhi especially. It's not some dry, vast void, right? That's devoid of any qualities, right? But the way in which emptiness is described, especially in the Mahayana, is that it is inseparable with compassion. This is really an amazing idea. We're talking about the foundational nature of all phenomena. is not just that they are empty of self-existence, but that emptiness of self-existence is indistinguishable from compassion. And so in that, it's like when we act selfishly, we're fundamentally acting in discordance with the way things are. And likewise, when we act selflessly, compassionately, right? It's not just like little me running around doing the nice thing, right? But we're actually acting in accordance with the nature of reality, which is really an incredible idea, and likewise drives towards the sense of karma, interdependence, and the path to awakening altogether. When we act out of kindness, when we act out of compassion, it's like we are in the flow of truth, or closer to it anyway, more representative of it. Whereas acting selfishly is truly discordant and just continues the rounds of samsara, or cyclic existence. So we have lots of lists in Buddhism, and we like to be very precise about the way in which we distinguish things. And so likewise, loving kindness and compassion, of course, are defined differently, right, in Buddhist presentations. So, as you likely know, loving kindness, is the genuine desire to be happy, right? The genuine wish to be happy. Whereas compassion is a genuine desire to be free of suffering and its causes, right? Those actually have quite distinct valences when we think about them, and likewise when we practice them. When we're wishing for ourselves and others to be happy, it feels different, right? Than when we're wishing for someone or even ourselves to be free of suffering. Because with compassion there, we're actually confronting suffering and its causes directly, right? That's part of the idea. And likewise with both of these, the methods of working with them really often involves thinking of this world, this life, and samsara specifically, right? We're working with the people that we know, contexts that we are familiar with. We expand out. That's part of our practice as well. But we often begin quite literally very close to home. And so these have different feelings, right? The wish for others to be happy has a sense of happiness to it. But likewise, if we're generally or genuinely connecting to compassion, then we're necessarily connecting with the suffering that people endure as the object of our compassion. In both cases, the ultimate goal of loving kindness and compassion is to transcend samsara altogether, right? And so there's this sense of renunciation, which of course in the Mahayana is different than in previous traditions, where in earlier schools of Buddhism, the focus, in many respects, not all of them, was really about gaining liberation from samsara itself, right? And that included changes in our behavior, lifestyle, and so on. In the Mahayana, of course, we're renouncing this world, but the idea is that we stay with it, right? Our compassion is so strong that we wouldn't possibly leave anyone behind. And so we still have a sense of renunciation from that which keeps samsara spinning, but we remain within it in order to fully affect the benefit of beings. So with that, we see that these really are distinctly Buddhist, right? In terms of its objectives, in terms of its purview and its inclusion, and in particular, the ways in which even our discussion of loving kindness and compassion very much embeds the Four Noble Truths within them, right? We never get away from these foundational ideas, nor should we, right? The truth of suffering, the truth of the causes of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and of course the path that leads to it. So conviction in those especially is distinctly Buddhist, and really separates it both from more generic ideas surrounding the notions of mindfulness and metta practices in popular culture. And likewise, it also separates it from the research that's presently being done in neuroscience and psychology, right? They don't work with ideas of liberation and things like this. That's not their view. But they are very interested in how these practices can be of benefit, especially towards what we would call these days the wellness of beings, anyway. Not necessarily the liberation of beings, but at least the well-being of beings. So these practices have been studied in psychology and neuroscience for some decades now. And these days, it's really understood that the best practices in terms of the neuroscientific and psychological study of meditation are those which are, in fact, deeply informed by the tradition and experienced representatives of those traditions. But even as they reach out to those who come from these traditions, inevitably they are reinterpreted and innovated for a contemporary audience, a contemporary context, and likewise with that they become translated into these contemporary languages. So one area in which this is very helpful for us, because in working with Tibetan, it's interesting, like English has an incredible array of borrowed terms and likewise an incredible array of nuances of meaning. It's an incredibly rich language. Tibetan in many respects is more limited in part just because of the geography, right? It had interaction with other cultures, but they were much more limited. And so with that, there's just ways in certain degrees of nuance that don't quite convey as clearly in English. And this is where neuroscience and psychology can sometimes be really helpful. So for example, one core set of terms that are distinguished in the current study of neuroscience with regard to compassion is sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Sympathy, empathy, and compassion. And these, I think, are actually really helpful for us to explore because a lot of the time when we're using them, we don't necessarily distinguish them that clearly. There's a sense of positivity often around them, but just as we would in our Buddhist tradition, we should be very precise, right, in the ways in which we use language, even when it's our own, or perhaps even especially when it's our own. So the way in which sympathy is described and defined in neuroscience and psychology is that it is to feel for. I feel for you. Okay? And from this view, looking at sympathy in this way, it's really grounded in the I. It's grounded in our own perspective. And so while there is a sense of self and a sense of concern for another, there's also a sense of separation or distance there. It's not fully engaged. Okay? Is the way that sympathy is defined. Distinguished from that is empathy, which is to feel with. I feel like you do. And so in this, in feeling empathy or empathically connecting with another, we take the perspective of the other. And even further, this can lead to a conflation between self and other practically. This is what's observed, actually, in feelings of empathy, where the neuroscientist Tanya Singer describes this as emotional contagion. Because we actually feel the suffering of the person that we're connected with. And we have great evidence for this now. We actually do this. We take on empathic distress with the suffering of another, and unfortunately what can happen is that we can get stuck there. Right? So when we empathically connect with another, and a lot of time, even today, I mean, the way that we use empathy is often kind of elevated or vaunted, right? But what psychology is really finding, especially among health workers and so on, is that empathy can be deeply problematic and actually undermine people's ability to really be of service to others. And this is because of this sense of emotional contagion or empathic distress. We actually take on that suffering. We feel their suffering. And if we work in healthcare or related industry around a lot of suffering, can only imagine how hard that would be. And as Buddhists, in many respects, it almost could feel like the right thing to do, don't you think? Shouldn't we kind of be feeling that way when we're deeply connected with other people? We feel like our goal is to connect. And then, of course, inevitably, especially from a Buddhist view, when this whole world is samsara, that is a lot to take on. And it can wear us out. And so we see that in the health industry, and we can see it in our Buddhist practice as well. But the way that it's understood here is that empathy can serve as a precursor to genuine, or maybe we would say here, effective compassion. So the way in which compassion is presently defined in the scientific community is that it is a response to another's suffering. A response. It's not a replication of it. Okay? We don't take it on and experience their suffering empathically. Okay? That's not skillful. Instead, this response is the generation of warmth and the wish for ourselves and others to be free from suffering and thus to achieve genuine well-being by means of it. So that's a very important shift, right? We're not simply sitting with the pain of another, empathizing with the pain in a way that we feel it, which of course is taxing. Like we all suffer on our own, and then as bodhisattvas or as medical workers, we would be taking on the suffering of all of these others. And inevitably, I think a lot of us get into Buddhism, and I would think a lot of people get into the health industry because they actually care for people. That's my hope anyway. That's what I would think, right? And so we can see how empathy can really undermine their ability to serve that good intention. So we need to work towards this effective compassion. And what's shown is that working with it in these ways actually activate different parts of the brain. So empathy, right, this actually feeling like you do, activates the mirror neurons of the pain network. So you can actually view this in fMRI, and there's strong evidence that we actually do this. We reflect or even take on the suffering of others. Of course, we don't extract it from them, but we simply experience it. And so in that, it becomes almost doubly powerful, right? That samsaric aspect. So we suffer in response to the suffering that we encounter. And again, I mean, sometimes I think whether we're Buddhist or working in the health industry, sometimes we feel like that's almost what we're supposed to do. But compassion, defined in this way, about this sense of response, the generation of warmth and the wish for others to be free of suffering, activates both the motivational and reward systems in the brain. So not only are we inspired to act, but it actually feels good to do so. That's empowering, right? We take on these genuinely pro-social behaviors of caring and nurturing, and rather than be worn down by the suffering that we encounter, we actually find a sense of empowerment, right? A sense of purpose, a sense of will, hope, aspiration, in order to apply ourselves in activity. So that's really quite a shift. It's a subtle distinction, but a really important one, which we gain from current studies of compassion in neuroscience and psychology. And what they're going for there is the generation of resilience. On the one hand, resilience is absolutely necessary for all those who serve in the health industry who encounter so much suffering. And many of us here have probably encountered what it's like when resilience of this kind has not been well practiced. Bedside manner of medical professionals and so on have been described as challenging for some time. And again, you know, it's not through some sort of intent to be completely cut off, but it's probably just happened on account of working with so much suffering for so long. How can you deal with that? How can you work with people's pain? And for many physicians and so on, it's about making the right prescription, the right treatment, and so on. How do they stay clear enough in mind to make the appropriate diagnosis and likewise apply the proper therapy? Well, if they get lost in suffering, then over time, as we've seen and demonstrated during the pandemic especially, there's an incredible amount of burnout. And then we lose people who were likely founded on a good intention, but just can't continue with the degree of suffering that they're encountering. So we need resilience in healthcare. Likewise, I think as Buddhists, we really need to work with resilience as well. It's important that we keep these distinctions in mind to really help focus our practice and keep us most effective. And just because neuroscience is talking about this stuff right now doesn't mean that the tradition hasn't been onto it for, 1,000 years. So, of course, they have been aware of these types of problems, and likewise, they've addressed it very directly. And Ponlop Rinpoche has discussed problematic compassion in several places, where in the Mahayana, there's a Tibetan term for this that literally means mistaken or deviated compassion. Mistaken or deviated compassion, where we end up getting stuck in self instead of the benefit of other. And so again, if we get stuck with empathy and the suffering itself becomes overwhelming, right, then all of a sudden we're lost in our own suffering and we can't really be effective in service to others. In Mahamudra, it's termed compassion arising as an enemy, which is pretty hardcore. But of course, in the Mahamudra tradition, the Great Seal, we're really working with the nature of mind very directly, where emptiness, selflessness is a definitive component. And so if we have compassion arise in this way that reifies self and or reifies other, then that's necessarily the very antithesis of the view of Mahamudra. So in that, compassion would, in fact, arise as an enemy on the path. It would distract us from accomplishing it. So problematic compassion is very well documented. And the way that Rinpoche describes it is that if you get carried away by feeling so much pain without strengthening your own heart, it will not be genuine compassion practice because we cannot bring any benefit. And he concludes that piece by saying there is too much emotion and too little wisdom. Too much emotion and too little wisdom. So this really precisely identifies the problem, whether we're looking at it in a neuroscientific context, psychological context, Buddhist context, where the problem is that the emotion, in our parlance, the klesha, is still very much active, whereas the view of emptiness is not active enough. And what we find in our tradition is that, not surprisingly, many masters have instructed us to practice ultimate bodhicitta before relative bodhicitta. Which is pretty interesting, actually, because usually, emptiness, pretty abstract concept, a lot to work with, a lot to realize, right? We're supposed to get glimpses of this. It seems like a pretty tall order. And yet, in the actual practice, the methodology of achieving bodhicitta, we work with ultimate bodhicitta, the view, before relative bodhicitta. loving kindness, compassion, and so on. So in going a bit further into this from the perspective of the Lojong tradition of mind training, training in Bodhicitta is the second point. It comprises one of its core sections. And its core practice, especially in relative Bodhicitta, is the known as exchanging self and other, which comes from the Indian Buddhist tradition, and in particular comes from what we consider to be like the mega middle way people, like the Madhyamaka heroes. So it extends from Aryadeva in the 3rd century, Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti, circa the 7th century, likewise Shantideva in the 8th century, and then in Tibet especially, it extends from Atisha, who lived from 982 to 1054. So this is the way that this mode of practice, our preeminent relative bodhicitta instructions, made its way to Tibet and eventually made its way to us. So Atisha, whose name literally means surpassing kindness, arrived in Tibet in 1042. And part of what's interesting about this, especially these days, we're so familiar with the idea that, okay, Vajrayana is secret. Vajrayana is esoteric. It's restricted to initiates, right? And it's meant to be that way, the way it's got to be. But interestingly enough, this practice of exchanging self and other, the preeminent relative bodhicitta practice, was taught only to select small groups of disciples in India by Atisha, and in Tibet, he only taught it to his one heart disciple. So exchanging self and other in this perspective is an esoteric practice. It's restricted to a small set of initiates. And in this case, it really has to do with just how challenging it is as a mode of practice. It's not easy at all, and it's not for beginners. So the history of the tradition looks upon that, even if we've encountered this mode of practice, often known as tonglen, sending and receiving these days, at some point in our practice path. And so as we probably know, the basic idea of sending and taking is that we send out everything good and we bring in everything bad, negative, suffering, causes of suffering, and so on. And so in this, we need to learn to let go of all of our good qualities, even our good compassionate practice, any sense of identification we might have with it, and release it to the benefit of all. And what often happens, and maybe people here have experienced this as well, but oftentimes when we first approach the practice of sending and receiving, or giving and taking, is that we get overwhelmed. We get overwhelmed in this compassion practice of trying to exert and exude kindness and the alleviation of suffering for all. And, just putting it that way probably actually makes a lot of sense, right? The idea is we begin small, but we work our way out to take in all of samsara. And I remember the first time I experienced this, it was like the in of all the negativity, all this black smoke coming in was like just so intense. I got like clogged and backed up. I couldn't keep up. Couldn't keep up with transforming that into all of this positivity. And that reflects a problem and a fundamental misunderstanding of how we approach these practices. There's a strong sense of duality in that perspective, where there's me and there's everything else. And likewise, there's a strong sense of reality ascribed to all of this negativity and suffering. And so with that, we see again that the view of ultimate bodhicitta, the view of emptiness, when immature, is insufficient to really proceed with this practice. That means we really need to develop the view in order to make our compassion truly genuine and fully effective. So of course it's a path, and it's not going to be perfected while we're on the path. but we need to start working with that idea. And so what we learn from the Buddhist tradition, in distinction to the ways in which these practices are being presented in neuroscience and psychology, is that actually this view of emptiness, the view of ultimate bodhicitta, is absolutely necessary. And that's exactly as our tradition structures this type of practice. We have ultimate bodhicitta first, and then we do sending and receiving. Moreover, a very practical instruction, and this might strike us as, I don't know, hypocritical or paradoxical, is that we're told to generate compassion for who first? Who do we take on as our first object of compassion in the great selfless path of Buddhism? That's right, ourselves. Yes, exactly. Okay, so, again, that's something that we might think is paradoxical. We have this tradition of selflessness and we're supposed to be concerned about everybody else, but we focus on ourselves first. Well, of course, that's very practical. If we don't work with our own suffering, if we don't work with our own view of the world, how can we possibly be effective in our alleviation of suffering for others? We need to know ourselves, we need to know our practice, we need to develop in practice so that we become familiar with the nature of the problem and how to resolve it. So it really does make a lot of sense. And again, this isn't like some weird little distinction within some corner of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. This is just a practical instruction. We got to start with ourselves. It addresses realistically and practically the nature of the problem, such that as we do, we might be able to truly and effectively work with others, both on and off the cushion. So we began with these issues of secularization and appropriation, and I thought just to close out our discussion, we could explore one particular question a bit more in depth. But can tonglen and compassion practice be done by non-Buddhists effectively? What do you think? Can it be done? I sure hope so. If so, how? What we've seen here in the Buddhist presentation is that the view is absolutely essential to the relative aspiration and application of bodhicitta. So is it possible to practice compassion outside of these traditions that ascribe to these views?
I believe if a person selflessly believes that they are going to be of benefit for one or others that are suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, non-Buddhists are fully capable of that, right? Why not? And Buddhism doesn't say that, it's very explicit. Like a good action, according to the Buddhist tradition, is a good action everywhere. Like you don't get merit only if you're Buddhist. You know what I mean? And so likewise, that type of attitude, again, can be fundamental to our basic human perspective. So perhaps they can have enough there in their intention. And we've certainly seen plenty of great exemplars from other traditions who have held this intention and likewise affected it in the world wonderfully. Please.
So as you know, a therapist, yes, I work with this idea of compassion. I think it's a lot about balance. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people, first thing I was thinking about is that a lot of people want to sidestep compassion for themselves. It's kind of like spiritual bypassing in a way. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, they can get so caught up in themselves. So I think a lot of what I do as a therapist is to try to find that balance. Mm-hmm. to not take themselves personally, to not take things personally. But
Can you say a little more about the balance between what and what?
Between being all about themselves and not being about themselves at all.
Okay. Yeah, there is that tension there. And a lot of the time when we have that intention to really be of benefit to others and have this deep sense of caring concern, which again arises in many regardless of whether they're Buddhist or not, it almost seems like a betrayal or something to focus on ourselves, and then yet at the same time we probably do that a lot. Yeah.
To answer your question, I would like to think that it's possible, and referencing your mention early in the talk about inclusivity as being part of Buddhism. But I have a lot of doubt that it is possible, because I don't think, I think that emptiness is so intrinsic to tonglen. And the pitfalls, as you've already mentioned, are so many, for them. And I've experienced it myself, these pitfalls, for it to be misrepresented, misunderstood, and appropriated. That I do lean in the direction that it's not possible for non-Buddhists to truly do so, because it cannot be separated from the view.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, especially taking it all the way, on the one hand, there's a sense of what we might call relative benefit, right? Benefit in this world, alleviation of suffering in this world. And then there's the full attainment of bodhicitta in its most replete form, which is Buddhahood itself. I mean, that's what we're going for. And so, of course, these people wouldn't be looking for that. But it's interesting. I mean, I think in the science of it, when they've presented this structure and the distinctions between sympathy, empathy, and compassion, it's helped people gain that sense of separation such that they could be at least a little more effective. But I think, taking it all the way, that's a different intention, a different objective, and a different frame of reference. Yeah, that non-Buddhists, for the most part, would most likely not be aware of. Yeah. However, we would say they are capable of it, though, right?
Thank you for the conversation. I think it's really nice to have it. And that's kind of the point that I'd like to make too, is I think it is possible. But I think what needs to happen is we need to circle around these types of conversations and allow the community to inform each other. And to your point that maybe people won't be able to reach this idea of enlightenment, which us Buddhists might aspire for, but be able to experience some general true compassion on a relative level for one another, especially with how much you see mindfulness and compassion within the educational realm, which I'm a part of. My hope is that there's a lot of talk about it and there's a little bit of practice about it, but there's very, very little opportunity or space or time created for genuine conversations about it. It's like, oh, I tried to practice compassion and this is how I felt. How did it feel for you? I think that kind of conversation happening in a genuine way, my hope is that could be a way in.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and likewise opens up to a larger discussion about our generosity with our tradition and our practice. What does it mean to share what we've learned? And moreover, how do we offer it in a way that's truly genuine, which means with no direct expectation of return, no expectation that they're going to ascribe to all of our views, become part of our tradition, but just simply genuinely and fully benefit as a result of our practice. So that's something that I'm very interested in as well. And I think, as we move forward, we can see this larger popular interest in these practices, the way that they're being taught across various curricula and schools and elsewhere, as a tremendous opportunity for benefit. But I think we need to find this balance On the one hand, we come from a place in which we're deeply informed and appreciative of these traditions, but also act, as we've been taught, out of genuine bodhicitta in a way that doesn't expect any kind of return. It's really, truly, fully for the benefit of those in which we encounter.